Today's podcast is brought to you by Isoay Sports, the sports range for athletes looking for supplements that are free from all artificial colours, flavours, sweeteners and added fructose. Intense physical training programs place significantly higher nutritional demands on sports people, and Isoay Sports are committed to providing pure, nutritional ingredients that are truly complementary to a healthy, active lifestyle. You can visit isoaysports.com.au for more information. This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. Joining us in the studio today is Kira Sutherland, who's an experienced naturopath and sports nutritionist with more than 20 years in clinical practice and lecturing. She's the previous department head of nutritional medicine at one of Australia's leading naturopathic colleges and is currently completing her Masters in Sports Nutrition. She's passionate about working with athletes of all levels and has a special interest in endurance nutrition as she herself competes in Ironman triathlons. Kira consults with private clients as well as writing and speaking around the world on all things complementary medicine and sports-related nutrition. Kira also runs an online education platform mentoring other practitioners in holistic sports nutrition. And you can find out more about this at kirasutherland.com.au. Welcome so warmly to FX Medicine. Kira, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Now, we're going to be speaking about something that is, I have to say, quite alien to me. I am a rather sedentary older male. My younger years of volleyball and athletics have gone.
Yep.
I need to reclaim them. So I'm going to get you to lead me. We're going to be talking about optimised sports nutrition for competition, but also talking a little bit about injuries and how to avoid them.
Yep.
So I think, first of all, can you take us all through where you began? Because you are a rather tall lady.
Yes.
So have you always been in triathlons or have you done other sports as well?
So growing up, I was heavily into skiing, volleyball, mainly basketball and swimming. So I basically played any sport that was offered to me, as much as I could, and coached basketball even as a teenager. That was like my high school job, coaching little 7th grade girls. And so always involved in sport, very sporty. I've come from a very sporty dad. I'm an unsporty mum who wishes she played more sport but didn't. And always continued doing lots of sports. And then I hit my late 20s and that's when I heavily got involved in triathlon. I've never competed at a very super high level or anything like that. I didn't really focus on any sport enough to do that, but triathlon got me, and ultra running and all kinds of endurance sport, which then I was already a practitioner by my mid-20s. So it kind of led me down the road of working with athletes and sports nutrition, because I really wasn't involved in studying naturopathy when I went through.
You base your practice around nutrition a lot.
Yes.
And there's a pointed reason behind that. Can you take us through that?
Yeah. Well, I'm a naturopath and I love my herbs and I love, all things naturopathy. But with sports nutrition, it becomes very food-based first, because if you're not fueling a body properly, to use a car analogy, it seems funny, but you have to fuel the body properly with those macronutrients first. So I do become very macronutrient based, because if you're not getting those right foods in first, you're not going to perform. You cannot get there. You can't recover. Adaptation starts to struggle for different sports. So always food first, and then I'll add on nutrients sometimes later, or herbs. But it also depends if you're working with a person just trying to run their first 10K or marathon, I can give them anything I want. Or if I'm working with a high-end drug-tested athlete, then your hands are tied to almost anything but foods.
Can you take us through the testing that Australian supplements have to go through, where they fail with regards to sports? What are the extra things that would be required to satisfy, elite athletes?
Yeah. So the way we test in Australia, from our debacles in the early 2000s, which I was a practitioner when that all went down, and there was problems with supplements and pharmaceuticals, the TGA actually is doing a phenomenal job of keeping our supplements very clean. We're considered in Australia to have some of the cleanest, most thoroughly tested supplements in the world, as far as I'm aware, and from what I understand through research and talking to other practitioners and professors. So there's TGA testing of supplements, which we're all aware of as practitioners. But then when you work with drug-tested athletes, there's a whole nother, there's two other sides to this. There's supplements that are, or constituents or things that are specifically banned, like drugs and steroids and amphetamines and things like that. So there's that issue. And then there's the issue of, even if a supplement doesn't contain something that's banned, it doesn't mean it's a safe supplement for an athlete that's drug tested, because you have the issue of contamination. And so we now, luckily, in Australia, and starting to be around the world as well, we have third-party testers where after you go through all your TGA testing, you can also send your supplements or certain supplements to third-party testers who are going to put it through screening of, I think it's around 300 or 400 specific substances that they're looking for as a banned substance, just to make sure there's no contamination going on from the manufacturing process. And then that supplement, if it goes through all those tests, and they have to test every single batch. So you have to send a certain, they test, I think, 3 separate batches first before they get the seal of approval. And then you have to actually get every batch tested. And so that's quite expensive for supplement companies to do. So even if companies are doing it, they're only testing a few products, but they're considered safe in sport.
Yeah.
And that is a big process. But we finally have this over just the last couple of years, whereas before this, 20 years of clinical practice, I didn't have supplements I could legally, I couldn't safely use because you never know if it's contaminated or not. And I'm not willing to risk my career, and I'm not willing to risk a 2-year to lifetime ban for an athlete. I don't need to.
No, that's right.
No supplement creates such an enhancement of performance that it's worth a ban.
So what do practitioners need to know about it? Just basically hands off with supplements in elite athletes?
In my opinion, yes. You always want to be safe. Like I said, it's not worth your career. It's not worth their career. You don't want to have to use your insurance. So really, unless it's been approved, unless it's that third party approved, and at the moment in Australia, we have 2 companies. We have HASTA and we have Informed Sport. And those are the 2 companies at this point that I know that are doing that third party testing.
Yep.
And unless it has that actual seal of approval, it'll be on the actual packaging. I wouldn't go anywhere near it. Nobody needs vitamin C that badly or herbs that badly.
So even if it was not on the ASADA list,
it has nothing. Yes.
If it was approved by who was one of these?
HASTA or Informed Sport.
Informed Sport.
Yep.
So if it was approved by Informed Sport, they could still take that supplement?
Yes,
Is that
they
what you're
can
saying?
take it. Yes,
Gotcha.
Absolutely. And there's, probiotics and zinc and vitamin C and magnesium.
Electrolytes.
There is now magnesium that's been tested, supplements, a lot of protein powders you definitely want tested. And the big thing, to go back to the international issue, is certain countries don't nearly have the regulations like we do with the TGA. And so certain countries, who shall not be named, have very poor record of contamination
with whey
or purposeful contamination. If I accidentally have extra stuff in my whey that makes it work better, I'm going to sell it more, because it's not about the athlete, it's about the business.
Yeah.
So
for athletes, make sure that it's got the correct approval.
Yeah, and just because it's not on the banned list doesn't mean it's safe.
No.
If it's not on the banned list, it's not banned, but it doesn't mean it's not contaminated. And that's the big difference. And I spend my life on blogs and things kind of clarifying that for practitioners, and just calling a company. I've had this multiple times. People are like, I called such and such company and their hotline practitioner said it didn't have any banned substances. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's
not
great.
Stand up in court.
And the other problem is, if athletes test positive, did they really purposely take something or not? They often won't. Yeah, there's whole controversy of, did they really take anything or not, or are they going to even admit that, or are they going to blame? The easiest thing to do would be blame a supplement. I'm not saying people do that, but it has happened.
Well, pass on blame.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't need to be that scapegoat. Yeah. No practitioner does.
No, that's right. About the eating guidelines for athletes. Now, we have so much marketing, TV marketing rammed down our throats for sponsorship stuff. What really should we be learning about the real health of nutrition for athletes?
Look, it really depends on what sport someone's doing. If you've got a strength sport, if you have a power sport, if you're doing endurance sport, not sometimes, the nutrition is different for each sport.
Yeah.
But the big thing I focus on with athletes is recovery nutrition. So getting in your macronutrients in the right ratios for whatever sport you're doing right after training. There's all these theories around, do you have this window of opportunity to get your fueling in? And it's a little bit controversial, but if you go back and listen to most of the professors talk about it and the research, there are these better windows of opportunity of properly refueling within an hour of training, let's say.
Yeah.
And yes, sometimes the window can actually be 2 hours, but in reality, you'll hear all the professors in nutrition say it's about eating as soon as possible to get the fueling process started.
And would this be weighted towards protein to aid in that amino acid thing, or is it whole balance?
It's often around carbohydrates after training. And the big controversy over the last decade is everyone's carb phobia.
Yeah.
And then it depends on nutrition after training really depends on what your goal of the training is and where you are in your season. So I'm gonna talk endurance because that's my real specialty. So often you have people that are exercising twice a day, and how you need to fuel someone after their first session in order to really get them going for their second session later in the day.
Yeah.
You're going to have a bigger carbohydrate focus. And you will always have, not always, but you often want protein right after training as well. But they're doing two different things. You got the protein there for the, supporting the muscle damage and rebuilding. But then you also need the carbohydrate for the glycogen replacement because that really is your fuel tank. And if you're not replacing that, you're going to run into trouble at your next hard training session. But there's also research now where you're picking certain times of the week or of the day in training where you're purposely not replenishing carbohydrates in order to have what we call a train low state. So you're pushing the body for different adaptations in a train low state, but people are misunderstanding that. And I'm not anti-low carb. I'm not pro super high carb. I'm a middle carber. It's about knowing when to be low carb and when to be high carb. Well, it's a controversial topic.
You've just created a new tag. I'm a middle carber.
Yeah. Nobody doesn't like carbs, but it's about fueling at the right time for the right outcome.
Yeah.
And that's what we often don't study in naturopathy. We're not studying sports nutrition and fueling different styles of training.
Can I ask, and this is more of to get a question out of my head that was taught to me by a lecturer, one of my first physiology, anat and phys lecturers, and he was questioning whether the immediate carb load before a race.
Yes.
And there was a lot of conjecture. Now this is 30 odd years ago.
That's okay.
And it was basically, does a Mars bar, I know, bad example, but does a Mars bar before a race cause an increase in glucose or a reactive decrease in glucose?
Yeah. No, that's a great question.
What's the current thinking now?
Well, Mars bar's kind of fat loading too, let's be honest, right?
I know. That was an example.
Yeah. So before, there's the whole idea, carb loading came in the 70s. And it was really extreme, and we were doing almost ketosis for a while and then a supercompensation phase. And that was very hard on people's bodies. As we all know, we get very cranky when we're in first few days of ketosis. And we now know to do more of an abbreviated carb loading where we don't put people really low. We just, for the last couple of days before an event, take up the carbohydrate and slightly drop protein and fats and fiber. And we get almost the same results. So it's much easier these days to abbreviated carb load. Whereas what you're talking about is ingesting something right before an event.
Yeah.
And there's theories because there is what's known as, like a reactive hypoglycemia. And what most of the research says, and Professor Asker Juckendrup, who's kind of one of the gurus of sports nutrition, he has done quite a bit of research on this because this is where people will have a big hit of 15 minutes before starting a marathon, people will have a sports gel or a banana. They'll have around 25 grams of carb. Usually they're doing carb, not Mars bars. Maybe that's two.
It was a bad example.
Yeah, it's all right. So you have that with some water. And the theory is once you start your race, you don't tend to have these huge spikes of blood sugars and then a drop because of the hormone profile and everything going on with you actually starting to move. It'll keep blood sugar levels more stable in the body. You'll use that carbohydrate as fuel. But what it turns out is there are responders and non-responders to that, or there are certain people who do get that reactive hypoglycemia.
Right.
So really, it's about trialing it for yourself.
Yeah.
But Asker's research of the last couple of years is showing it's a lot more rare than we think to be one of those reactive responders.
Gotcha. And how would you differentiate? Do you think something like, SIPE testing, genetic profiling through SNP testing?
Oh, that's really interesting. I haven't thought about it that way, because the genetic testing is so new.
I really don't know if that's a good question or not. But just went,
it's called trial and error. N equals 1. Sports nutrition has its, sports nutrition, are there rules or are there guidelines?
Yeah.
Really, it gets down to working with patients. There are guidelines and you need to trial and error them and play around with people's race nutrition long before their actual race day. The number one thing is you never try anything new on a race day, right? And it's amazing how many people do. So you would get someone in a long, say they were running a marathon and you wanted to know weeks before their marathon, you get them to take a banana or their gel or, my favorite, which is a bit more holistic, is, 2 medjool dates has about the same quantity of carbs as a gel without not quite the electrolyte profile.
Yeah.
And you get them to trial that. So they have it 15 minutes before their run with enough water to help dilute it so you can absorb it quickly, and you see how they feel. And people with that reactive drop will feel really weak about 10 to 15 minutes into their run. And it's good to trial it in training because you don't have all the hype and adrenaline of being in a race, because often people can feel quite weak and a bit nervy and anxiety with a race. So that can often feel like a low, but is it a low or is it more their nerves in the beginning of a race?
The thing that would happen there also is that the performance on that day, your personal best or you're just not on, you're just not switched on that day. So you'd have to do it like 2 or 3 times, I would imagine, to say, no, that really doesn't work for me.
Well, the people I know that have had that reaction really know they've had that reaction.
Okay,
so most
dramatic.
of the time with athletes, you can kind of say, do you do this before, do you eat before you go training or not? That's a really good indicator right there of how they're going to go. Some people will go, no, I absolutely feel sick if I early morning train with food in my stomach. And then other people are the complete opposite. They're like, I absolutely have to eat before I train. And there is research coming out, or, people are looking at research at the moment that, sometimes women are actually, we think, better off at having something small before training more so than men. And this is really new stuff, and there's not a lot of depth around it yet, but it's a very interesting thing to look at because fasted training is such a hip and popular thing at the moment, and doing long fasted training, which is going along with intermittent fasting and ketosis training and things like that. And sometimes for women, we're looking at a lot of research that's been done on men, and we don't have that depth of research on women, and we're starting to question, are women, do they actually feel better eating before training?
Why are there not more studies specifically on women and timing around the period?
There is more research happening now. Until the 1970s, there was almost no research done on women, especially in sport, but just in general. I think we had to invent the pill in the 50s before we actually started trialing women on stuff. But that's a general statement. That's not fact. That's a curious statement.
But the fact is that women are largely excluded from many sports trials, and yet we're supposed to extrapolate the results and apply them back to women.
There's some female researchers out there writing some great regular books, and there's also research actually finally being done on women, specifically their hormone cycles and how they should be training and how different it is between the follicular and the luteal phase. and where you're going to get your performance benefits. So that's a real space to look at. I think statistically, I read 39% of sports science trials are done. Women are included in the trials. The reason we haven't included women for a lot of the years is because you would need to put them, a lot of what people say is you'd need to put them on the pill to regulate how their performance is going to make it similar to men. But then what you're doing is you're really testing women and their performance on the pill. You're not testing women and their performance or their reaction to certain nutrients. So it's tricky because if you regulate it, then we're not actually getting real results. And the problem is, too, with a lot of clinical trials is you have such a time constraint for when you can actually do the clinical trial to wait and, test a woman in her follicular phase. The trial's going to extend a lot longer time-wise, and often you don't have the funding for that. So it just makes it too tricky to wait for every woman to get onto her follicular phase to do certain blood tests and strength tests and things like that.
The converse would be the assumption that men, therefore, have unwavering levels of testosterone.
Very true.
Do men's levels of testosterone and other anabolic hormones have a cycle, so let's say due to their circadian rhythm? And why is this not discussed?
We don't. Maybe it's no. There is research starting to look at circadian rhythms and performance and different body types. The ectomorph, endomorph, mesomorph is actually coming back, and we're looking at. There's research looking at how they perform differently depending on their circadian rhythms, depending on what quote. I can't think of what it's called. Body type. It's not the right. Scientific term.
Yeah.
We are looking at how their neurotransmitter, we're more dominant in certain neurotransmitters. Yeah, I was reading research on that recently, which is kind of, oh my God, it's crazy.
Let's talk about glycemic index as a manager of diet, if you like. Is that something that you adhere to, or is that something that you discuss, or do you find it just gets too convoluted and as you said, you've got to do the N=1? Does that work for you?
Look, there is a place for it, and it has progressed over the years between glycemic index, glycemic load, and there's people that are like, should we even be looking at this or not? Is this old school? Has that been put to bed now altogether? With sports specifically, there is a place where you want fast digesting food. If you're in a recovery phase post-training, and you have more training to back up for 4 or 6 hours later, there is a place where you want readily digestible foods. So, there is a time where you're suggesting slightly higher GI foods because you don't want to inhibit the speed of absorption and utilization of, say, carbohydrates. So sports nutrition still does use it to an extent. I don't really talk, if we're looking at my clients, do I talk GI a lot? No, but I'm not letting them add avocado and chia seeds and tons of fiber to maybe a post-training smoothie if I know they're going to back up 5 hours later with more training. Whereas someone who's only training once a day, then we're going to look more at holistic nutrition, and I'm not going to focus so much on that super fast glycogen recovery.
To a great extent, various body types would be attracted towards various sports. For instance, you don't tend to get too many short people playing basketball. You don't tend to get too many tall, skinny people doing weightlifting.
No.
Certainly not the heavyweights. Do you find that you really have to waver the ratio of carbs, fat, protein to their specific type of sport? Like, for instance, a weightlifter.
Yep.
Big muscles, muscle mass, retention of muscle mass, particularly after straining those muscle fibers and, let's say leading to DOMS. Do you have to make sure that you're providing what we would consider a massive amount of protein to carbs, say?
Yeah. Yep. Each sport definitely has its profile of carb to protein ratios, but then it is really dependent on body weight and body structure. So are they that big muscle mass type person, or are they the really lean? And also, if you're not working with high-end athletes who usually are in specific sports for their body type, otherwise they're going to really struggle. If you're dealing with, I want to say my Joe Schmo running a marathon for their first time, I have 110 kilogram men that want to run marathons, and I have 65 kilo men that want to run marathons. So they're both doing the same sport, but they metabolically operate a bit differently. So yeah, it's very, sports nutrition, it has its ideas and suggestions of carbs and protein, but then you really have to regulate it for their body type or their sex. Women tend to, operate a little bit less carbs sometimes women tend to get away with versus the men, but we don't have that. Our metabolic rates aren't what I'm a little jealous of male metabolic rates at times.
Not of mine.
And it's also about exercise, right?
Yeah, that's right. There was that component.
So it's very individual. But I do have my guidelines, and the protein research over the last 5-7 years is amazing, and realizing our need for higher protein volumes is we're getting very specific with when we actually give protein. And there's research now of, do you give it in 3 lots during the day, or should you give it over 6 littler periods, and especially protein at night right before bed for muscle adaptation and protein synthesis. There's some really fascinating stuff. And the RDA for protein is still very low, or it's not low. It's what the average human has, needs to stay out of protein deficiency. But we are now starting to have actual amounts for athletes come out, and they're much higher than the RDA. And we are having research now looking at large protein amounts, and is that causing problems with bones and all that stuff. And so that's really the mythology around some of that is actually being dispelled.
What about stage of life as well? Like, at no time in history are you getting so many
called masters athletes.
Yes, masters athletes. Thank you very much for the politically correct term. Doing these, elite athletic performance things, particularly marathons and ultra marathons and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
What about the relative protein deficiency and, the nitrogen balance versus the phosphate balance? You're talking about bones.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of practitioners and dietitians and naturopath nutritionists are looking at, when you take someone's protein levels up, really needing to buffer it and getting in, the biggest thing is getting all your greens in and those large volumes of more alkaline foods. But there is research that came out in the last year or two on the older we get, the more protein we're needing for sport and for retaining muscle. So the masters athletes, let me just qualify too. I think of masters athletes as over 50, but in the swimming world, I think you only need to be 25 to be considered a masters athlete. Yeah, each sport has a different regulation on that. And I was having good chuckle that once you're over 25, you're a masters swimmer.
What a cracker.
And because there's like masters Olympics and stuff like that, right? They're actually... Rumor has it that they're doing more performance-enhancing things than the elites.
Really?
Yeah,
they want to retain their youth.
They drug test at masters competitions as well.
They're the begrudging masters.
So
they don't want to be 50.
Yeah. So we now know for holding, muscle mass as you age, protein needs are really going up.
When you're talking about performance and injuries and recovery, one of the most common conditions is DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness.
Yep.
A bit of achy pains for us people that might go for a run and we think, it's doing as good because we've just ripped the muscle fibers. Tell me if I'm physiologically correct or incorrect, please.
Yep.
So that you've just ripped a myofibril and it now has to heal and you now then... Well, that's what the recovery...
muscle repair.
That muscle repair, Traditionally, if we weren't in an elite athletic association or anything, or we weren't beholden to anything, we'd just take some bromelain and maybe a little bit of zinc and perhaps some methyl sulfonyl methane. So we'd take some supplements and we might, even take something like an aspirin or an NSAID.
Yep.
What can you and can't you do when you're talking about elite athletes with regards to nutrition and/or can you use supplements at all?
Look, you can. If they've been tested, you can use supplements. And this is also where you go food first. And a woman I studied with came out a year or two ago with a great article on muscle recovery and foods and what foods actually responded, the muscles responded best. So delayed onset muscle soreness really peaks 3 to 4 days after that big damaging output that you've done. And this is where you're going to use pineapple and you can use turmeric as a food and ginger. And there's also a point, and people do go for, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. But the problem is as well, part of the cascade in DOMS is, well, you've got this inflammation and then the body's repairing. There's theories on, do you actually want to inhibit that inflammation? Because the inflammation, if you block all the pathways,
are you inhibiting repair?
Yeah. And that's always the big question there as well. And that's where I will go proper food first and nutrients, as long as you're using the core of the pineapple, you're getting a good amount of bromelain, turmeric powders. Tart cherry is another one. And then people are also looking at pomegranate.
Oh, really?
A high antioxidant or high phytonutrient foods.
But foods,
is
not
where I go
supplements.
first because it's safer.
Yeah.
Right?
So if you can take tart cherry as the drink.
Yeah, there's research on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're allowed to do that, but as a supplement in a bottle, you're not.
Yeah, well, the question is your juice tainted? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's the $1 million question, and it is a really tricky thing to have to look at. But there are starting to be, drinks and tart cherry juice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like I'm slightly changing the subject, but there's now research on using pickle juice for cramping. And there's starting to be produced
pickled juice. Hang on.
Juice, like gherkin, like the
gherkin
juice.
juice.
Yep. And we're not.
So the vinegar.
It's a vinegar, but there's a lot of salt, and we're not
Nitrates.
even. Yeah, and they're not even sure in the research. I can send you through some of the papers. They're not. The minute the juice hits the mouth, it somehow releases the cramp.
Wow.
And they're using this in a lot of high-end rugby, as far as so I've heard.
Yeah.
And for these chronic cramping people, the whole idea of cramps is the $1 million question as well.
Yeah.
Magnesium, calcium, sodium, dehydration. A lot of my clients cramp, and it's really that they've changed their position on their bike, and it has nothing to do with nutritional issues, or they, famously push too hard in a race beyond where they've trained, and then their muscles start cramping up, and then they want to blame it on nutrition protocols, and it's not. It's their own ego racing too hard.
But I do remember years ago, I ran into some researcher at QUT who was doing work on cramps, and they were doing biopsies of the gastrocnemius.
Yeah,
There's a horrible test.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because this is a trocar.
Yeah.
This is not a light little,
No.
It's not a fine needle aspiration.
No.
That's a hurty one.
A professor I study under has a few, 'cause sometimes you get caught out. He does a lot of weight training, and he's a big build, and he's got a few scars on his thighs and gastroc, and he talks about you want to avoid muscle biopsies. It's the big problem too. Elite athletes don't want the biopsies because it's going to injure the muscle.
Yeah, that's right.
Yet then we end up having to test on beer drinking university guys and people that need the money. So it's an interesting thing, but I won't be. I've seen the scars from muscle biopsies. I will not be volunteering for a muscle biopsy.
What about overtraining? We all want to perform better. There's that risk of going way too far, as you said, and causing cramps and other deleterious effects, even injuries.
Yeah.
How do you ward against overtraining? Where do you teach people about the limit?
Yeah.
And how do you recover high-end athletes, at least? And so what about weekend warriors from overtraining?
Yeah, absolutely. And, high-end athletes have whole governing bodies behind them, and physios and strength and conditioning coaches. So you have sports physicians, and they have a whole team making sure that they're not going into overtraining, or, there is a point where you are overreaching and you need to for certain adaptation processes, but then they have to pull it back. So the high-end athletes, you're not going to, as a practitioner, as a naturopath nutritionist, you're not going to see it that often, but you will see it in your weekend warriors who are, your type A personalities who are, running big companies and working really hard, and then they're waking up. I had a client come in the other day, and she said, I'm training for this ultra, and I had to get up at 3:30 in order to get in my long run before my kids woke up. And then I'm talking about her needing to have a smoothie after her run before she does, and I don't have time. And it's like, well, then you're not going to have time to run later if you don't, So it's your weekend warriors are a big problem with overtraining. And this is where holistically our industry is amazing. And we need to really focus on our holistic principles of health. Overtraining is about fueling properly after eating, fueling properly before eating if you need it or during eating. And it's about sleep. It's about rest and recovery. And athletes are shocking at getting enough sleep. Sleep and hydration are the two things people fall down on more than anything. And that's stuff we know. So if you're a practitioner that doesn't specialize with athletes and you haven't done a lot of study on that, this is where you can come in with your holistic principles because they're still the same and they're almost more important because they are going to have slightly higher cortisol and going to be very fatigued. And then overtraining, unfortunately, leads to poor sleep quality.
Yeah.
And so it's this vicious cycle of how to break that. And then we've got arsenal of our holistic tricks to use with people to hopefully get them back to a better place to be able to train harder.
But there's a real issue with supplementing during training, and then you'd have to have a certain graceful gap before any competition took place.
Yes.
So any supplementation that you gave for beneficial effects, would that then be negated by that gap that you have to give them before competition?
I go for it anyway because you're just trying your best. And often people don't give you enough time. So you're throwing everything at them in the hopes that they are doing better. And hopefully they have come in before they're in that really bad place. But one of the things I see a lot with athletes is immune suppression, because training strengthens your immune system. It actually works better, but it does also suppress it to an extent. And what a lot of people don't understand is it's not just about supplements for the immune system. How you fuel your body with your macronutrients and your timing of fueling around sport goes a long way to keeping cortisol levels low and to supporting the immune system. And there is whole ways to look at your nutrition to support the immune system as well as nutrients. But people dig themselves holes and then they keep training while they're sick, which is my pet hate.
You mentioned whey earlier on and the issues with, whey that's sourced from overseas.
Yes.
Australia, as you say, has a very good reputation for supplements.
Yes.
But then whey is a food. So how does this sit?
How's my naturopath feel with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you are not allergic, sensitive, whatever word we're going to use, everyone has.
Yep.
Anyway, reactive.
It's intolerant. It's not
intolerant. Yeah.
Allergy is IgE by definition.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm just saying what the clients come in saying, and so with intolerances, if you're intolerant to something, I'm not going to make them have it. We have a lot of other protein powders accessible these days. They've got hemp and pea and rice protein, and you have your bevy of more vegan or vegetarian style ones. But in the research, so let's leave intolerances aside because that's an individual thing with each of your clients. Intolerances aside, whey protein outperforms other protein powders. Whey protein outperforms most other proteins in studies for sports nutrition. So whey does have its place if there is no intolerance with athletes. And it makes it very easy. And, recovery smoothies when people don't have time are fantastic. And people, there's this whole controversy of are people overeating or under-eating protein? And a lot of athletes are under-eating protein. And it's an easy way. The RDA for protein is like 0.8.
Yeah.
0.75, 0.8. Many athletes, the ranges for how much protein they need average between 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight all the way up to 2. Recommendations are in this
a minimum
huge,
of 30% above the
huge,
RDA.
Yeah. And we're starting to finally have research with set amounts for athletes. And there was research that came out, I think it was just last year, on if your whole body training, taking in a larger volume of protein, like 40 grams. These are for specific men in this research, but they were looking at a 40-gram bolus of pure protein versus if you're only training smaller parts, so it's a leg day, then 20 grams of protein in that post-training meal being sufficient.
So it even varies depending on which muscle group they're training.
Yeah, absolutely. So whole body training has this much higher requirement. That's research that came out last year.
So this is really nuanced.
Yeah. Oh, sports nutrition is very nuanced. And it's why sometimes when practitioners take on sports clients, but they don't have that understanding, you can have big holes in what you're actually telling a client to do because it's performance nutrition, which And the other thing is, and I tell this to students when I'm teaching sports nutrition, performance nutrition, unfortunately, isn't always under the holistic nutrition guidelines. There are times where
you're outside
you're recommending, maybe not a colored sports drink, but you're recommending, high volumes of fast digesting carbohydrates or sugars, if I can say the S word. And
what about the other S word, salt?
Yeah, absolutely. And salt's a massive one that they need. And I, because I'm involved with endurance nutrition, I'm giving out salt tablets. Well, I make them go by electrolyte tablets, which are super high sodium. There's events where people are on up to 1 gram of sodium per hour.
Whoa.
Yeah, if you're running, Hawaiian Ironman.
Per hour of event.
Yeah.
Yeah, not
a daily
not
life.
training or anything. But, Jesus.
But yeah, if you're in Hawaii and you're in a gazillion levels of humidity
or Death Valley,
and 30 degree heat you're racing for 9 to 17 hours, sodium is the number one. All the electrolytes are important, obviously, for all kinds of physiology, but it's the sodium that's the real crux. And in research, it's what we know is absolutely the most vital.
Let's talk about salt. You're talking about elite athletes. What about people like weekend warriors? They have to be very careful of the amount of salt, not as high. Look at a more balanced salt, magnesium, potassium, calcium.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty good at supplementing magnesium. I'm just going to say that now. That's probably my favorite supplement is a good magnesium powder with lots of cofactors in it. But no, if you have, your master's athlete running marathons and ultra marathons, they're in need of the sodium as well, maybe often to a similar level. The interesting thing with doing sports nutrition is you're looking at optimum nutrition and you're looking at optimum performance. I'm not dealing as often with chronic disease. And so it's a really different picture of client that I'm working with. So do I have a ton of athletes with high blood pressure? On my books at the moment, I can only think of 2, but they've become athletes after having heart attacks and all kinds of crazy stuff in their 40s. So, there is a point where what elite athletes do, your weekend warrior, depending on what events they're doing, they have to do similar stuff, not to that level, because they're not racing as hard. They're finishing in 16 hours, not 9 hours.
You're right.
But if you're out there for 16 hours, your nutrition's more vital than the 9 hour.
And the water as well.
And hydration is a huge thing. And the biggest issue is hyperhydration, not just dehydration. Everyone worries about dehydration, but the biggest issue with your weekend warrior is overhydrating and then depleting blood sodium levels and potentially leading our incidence of hyponatremia in endurance events is on the increase. And it's not the elite athletes it's on the increase with. It's the weekend warriors that go out and they have no idea about their sweat losses per hour and they chug down way too much fluid without enough sodium. They're scared of it. And every few years, there's somebody dies in a marathon or an Ironman because they've literally waterlogged themselves.
Now, I spoke with Professor Tim Noakes.
Yeah,
about
brilliant.
He was saying, nobody ever died of dehydration. I'm like, well, really?
Well, you collapse first.
Yeah. However, it wasn't too long ago. Are we talking December 2017, January 2018? Somebody died in a marathon.
The problem with dehydration is you lose temperature control. Or thermoregulation, if you want me to be scientific. Sorry, I'm quite the lay person when I speak to people. Too used to talking to clients.
Which is temperature control.
Yeah, temperature control. So, if you're swimming in the ocean and that's colder than your body temperature and you're dehydrating, you're going to start to lose body temperature and you have hypothermia. But if you're in the heat, i.e. Australia, every day except 2 months of winter, you have, heat stroke issues and all kinds of stuff. So somebody collapsing might have been, and I don't know that story. I was too busy skiing, but
fine.
Yeah, but you've got heat stroke, getting too hot, all kinds of stuff. But you also have the issue, as Tim Noakes has written a whole book called Waterlogged, the recommendations of how much to drink. his book on waterlog is about the American College of Sports Medicine. I think it was them. Their recommendation was too vague, and people were misunderstanding it and overhydrating, and causing problems with hyponatremia, which can also lead to hospitalization and death. So there's that fine line between how much you should drink. And when I was doing my graduate diploma in sports nutrition, my final year project research was looking at guidelines of how much to drink in marathons and what should we be actually suggesting to people to drink or not. And it's really around education, because we're all individual. I've had clients so one of the things to do with clients, and everybody should do this if they're working with athletes, is to get them to go out. You weigh yourself naked before training on a digital scale. Write it down because you'll forget. Go out for your 1 hour race pace. If you're a runner, you go out your 1 hour race pace.
Yeah.
Don't drink, or at least measure what you drink. Come home, dry off, weigh yourself again. And yes, there's a 10% variation. We know that because you've lost glycogen, which is body weight as well.
Yeah.
But they say, and the IOC says it's close enough. However much, so say you lost 700 grams, that's the equivalent to 700 mils of fluid you need per hour. And you wouldn't think it would vary that much between people, but I had 3 80-kilogram men that were all different ethnicities, and they were doing a 24-hour endurance race. And so I made them go do sweat tests at night, in the day. One of them lost 400 mils an hour, and another one, same body weight, not same body type, 1.2 liters an hour. So had I said 800 mils an hour.
3 times, 300% difference.
Had I said, and they were going the same pace, right? Because they were running together. So had I said 800 mils, I would have hypohydrated and I would have hyperhydrated somebody else. And that's how individual sports nutrition is.
N equals 1 is the message of today,
it's crazy.
And we talk about, how we shouldn't be lumping all proteins together, all fats together, I mean, it's the whole dietary issue.
Yep.
Fat does not equal fat. So when you're talking about sugars, now you get dextrose, sucrose, fructose, maltodextrose, which I've seen in one endurance thing. Yeah. And very smartly labelled as was it a slow-release carbohydrate?
Yeah.
I think it was I've also had that question. Some people say maltodextrose is actually very quickly absorbed. What's happening?
So again, Professor Juckendrup, Asker Juckendrup, if you go on, I think his website, you can just Google him, or mysportscience.com, I think is his website. He has incredible infographics. I actually use them a lot in teaching because you can purchase them as a teacher to use. But he has incredible infographics on specifically what you're asking about. And there are times where you want more fast-digesting carbohydrates, and there's other times where you want slower ones. And the whole fructose thing comes up because our industry is very anti-fructose, high fructose corn syrup, and people, issues with the liver and, fat and all that stuff. I didn't need to go into that. But in sports nutrition, now remember I said race day nutrition is not about perfect health nutrition.
Yeah,
race days are performance. And, people drink... I'm not saying I'm a fan, but do people drink soda, Coca-Cola at that, in marathons? Absolutely, because they're looking for a flavor change, a sugar hit, and the caffeine hit. I know it's bad for them, but I'm not. That's what people do. So with the different sugars, there's actually research on. And in sports products, sometimes they're made just maltodextrin, sometimes they're made glucose, sometimes you're going to see glucose and fructose together, and our industry will go up in arms and say, absolutely not, no. And there are products that are specifically marketed that they have no fructose, which can be great, but we know that through the gut lining, so when you're racing, you want easily absorbable sugars, and maltodextrin is absorbed very quickly through the gut lining because of its molecular structure. But what we now know is you have 60 grams an hour of glucose that can go across your gut lining through, and fructose goes through a different absorption pathway than glucose.
Yeah.
And sometimes in endurance sport, you're trying to get in more than 60 grams an hour
So you
of
need
fuel.
that active pathway.
And so there is research on using what's known as, you'll see it in the sports literature, multiple transportable carbohydrates. And you're looking at giving different ratios of different carbohydrates because you have a saturation of certain, pathways that you're trying to bypass to get in up to 90 grams an hour. But, these are your guys doing the Tour de France and things like that. So there is sports products that will contain both. And we all react to different things. People go, oh no, fructose causes all these gastrointestinal issues. You're going to have all this trouble with racing. And again, N=1. If your body can handle it, it's why you trial your race nutrition long before race day so you don't end up in the porta potties.
I'm amazed at your knowledge, and thank you so much for exploding so many myths that I had, that I'd held on to for decades.
Yeah.
For all of our listeners, Kira's going to help us out with putting some of these papers up on the fxmedicine.com.au website, and we'll certainly put your website up there.
Thank you.
So that they can contact you and learn more. So if they're treating or want to treat elite athletes, or indeed become involved themselves. So thank you so much for joining us on FX Medicine today.
It was exciting to come.
This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. Registrations are now open for the joint AIMA Australian and New Zealand Conference and Retreat to be held from April the 11th to 15th in Auckland, New Zealand, 2018. To tell us more, we have AIMA President Dr. Penny Caldecott on the line. How are you, Penny?
I'm great. Thank you, Andrew.
Now, tell us who'll be speaking at the AIMA conference and what will delegates take away?
So this conference is Personalised Medicine, the New Healthcare Revolution, and we've got a wonderful lot of speakers, beginning with Dr. Bruce Lipton, who's going to be talking about new biology, new medicine and evolution in healthcare. We've got Denise Foness, who's going to talk about the clinical application of nutrigenomics, epigenetics and personalised medicine in Australia and New Zealand, and also going to give us the epigenetics 101. We've got Matt Ryman, who's going to be talking in detail about biotypology. Justin Sinclair, who's going to be speaking about the ethnopharmacology of cannabis, Neolithic to now. We've got Sue Gray and Tori Catherwood, two New Zealanders, a lawyer and a medical student, who are going to be speaking about medical marijuana. We've got Professor Julie Ruckledge talking about serum nutrient levels and are they important in predicting benefit from nutritional therapies. Lawrence Katsaris, who's speaking about the microbiome, which he says is the forgotten genome in personalised medicine. We've got Nicole Bilsma and Carolyn Ladowski, epigenetics and environmental toxins. Genetics load the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. We've got Professor Stephen Myers, whose talk is yet to be arranged, but always great value. Dr. Carolyn E. was going to speak about the freedom fighters for integrative medicine. She's got a couple of really key positions in Australia in integrative medicine. And then we've got two workshop sessions, one on advocacy for doctors and one on working together